Hi, everybody. This is Donnie Winchell from Ohio Wine Producers once more. This is a part of a series of videos that we are producing to help wineries get started and to understand some of the nuances of the wine business as they launch this dream journey of theirs. This one is about zoning, and it's very localized and it can become very difficult. And I will share that the material that we are offering in this video is extracted in part from some Farm Bureau information that was shared during one of our annual wine conferences, but absolutely is not to be regarded as any legal advice. It's just sort of some directions and some information that we've gathered over the months and years to help you understand some of the nuances of zoning and some of the difficulties you might face. First of all, who has control of zoning when it comes to wineries who grow grapes? And the grow grapes is a key component. County, and township zoning powers come from the state through the Ohio Revised Code. The Ohio Revised Code limits zoning authorities of these entities. In other words, the city, township zoning powers come to be. And this applies specifically to county and township zoning when it comes to the wineries. In 1978, the very first piece of legislation that was passed by the OWPA was House Bill 302. There was a winery in Southwest Ohio, highlighted here in Clark County, that was attempting to open a winery and was in a difficult series of discussions with their county commissioners. It was called Hafley Winery, and the guy was a little aggressive and created some hard feelings. He approached us, and we approached our then state representative, a fellow named Bob Boggs, who became later a state senator, and later a Department of Agriculture, and then finally a county commissioner in our county till he retired. Bob helped us draft this, looking at an existing piece of legislation. So, with limited exceptions, and there are some we'll talk about, county and township zoning authorities cannot prohibit the use of land for agricultural purposes. The language says they cannot prohibit the construction or use of buildings and structures incident to the use for agricultural purposes of the land on which such buildings are located, including buildings and structures that are used primarily for the vintning and selling of wine and are located on land any part of which is used for viticulture. This means that your grapes need to be grown on the property where your building is going to be built, and you must plant grapes. It does not include fruits or honey or any of the other things, only viticulture. And it says that no zoning certificate will be required for those buildings. It is important to pay attention closely to your zoning folks and not get into a kind of spitting match with them, but share this piece of information. If in fact anyone wants a copy of the legislation, we certainly have them in our office and we distribute them regularly. I will share, though, even with these zoning exemptions that are provided to you because you're growing grapes, health and safety considerations always remain in place. You can't ignore those, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, this is from the Ohio Farm Bureau. The exceptions to the agriculture zoning restrictions can be imposed if you are in a subdivision with 15 or more lots, and the locals, county and township, can come in if you have less than an acre. They also can require certain setbacks and heights of buildings if you have 1 to 5 acres. And if you're doing dairy, they can limit you even more. But for our purposes, under an acre and under 5 acres, there are some limitations that the locals can impose when it comes to building and structures for your winery to make way in the winery on which your viticulture land is located. So if you have more than 5 acres, you are exempt generally. Okay, in addition, when the legislation was written, it was the intent of the industry to protect authentically established vineyards with substantive vineyards that were really producing as much or at least a portion of the vines needed for the production of grapes that they were going to offer to the public. But in 2001, there was a very difficult case in a subdivision in sort of east central Ohio. And the Meriden case, for then the Meriden Winery, which now no longer exists. But it's important to understand that you just need to grow grapes. Again, our intent was for acres or at least rows and rows of vines to be the agricultural exemption. But in Sperry versus Terry in 2001, the Meriden case said that there was no limitation or no minimum requirement in terms of the number of vines that needed to go into the ground. When that case came up, Ohio Wines were neutral. We were asked to join in the suit and argue on behalf of the Meriden family. But we were very nervous because once things get into the courts, you're never quite sure what would happen. And there was some discussion when the case was first introduced that at least 50% of the grapes grown needed to go into the fruit in the winery. If they couldn't produce enough grapes for at least 50% of their production, they would no longer be agriculturally exempt. It was very complicated. So we stayed out of it because we were worried if the 50% of your production coming for your own fruit requirement was enforced, about half the wineries in Ohio would have not been qualified. So we remained neutral, especially because it was a very, very ugly neighborhood campaign. It was not pleasant at all. So there is no requirement for the amount of vines. If you have 3 or 5 or 7 vines and you meet the other requirements, you can claim this agricultural zoning exemption. But again, I would encourage you not to find yourself in a situation where you put 2 vines in a pot and irritate all of your neighbors because you want to call yourself agriculturally exempt. There was another major decision that occurred in 2020 with a winery in the very northeast corner of the state. They were building a winery and they wanted to include a wedding option, making it a wedding venue. And the local zoning inspector's idea of a wedding was 600 people drinking too much. And the winery owner's definition of a wedding was 35 people having a lovely time sipping a glass of wine. So the zoning inspector in this county created quite an uproar with the then winery owner. And so it got to the Attorney General, Betty Montgomery, at that time, provided this decision. If you are marketing your wine, it reasonably follows that a banquet or reception or party where you have entertainment, a music festival, a clam bake, all of those other kinds of things would constitute the marketing of an agricultural product. So we are allowed in the wineries because of this decision to do all the kinds of fun things that we do on our grounds without local zoning stepping in. Again, there are some exceptions. If you are abrasive, if you are creating too much noise, creating too much traffic, creating some headaches for your neighbors, you have to be careful what you do. So it's primarily focused on growing grapes and making wine. And again, it's an agricultural commodity. But if you're doing things that are too irritating to the community around you, remember we're in an era of social media and they can create all kinds of havoc for you in terms of neighborhood and community perception of what you're doing. So be very cautious, be responsible and responsive when you're doing these kinds of events to the community around you. Okay, the whole issue of growing grapes, making wine, agricultural exemption, and being able to market them became a little bit complicated by a system of alcohol control that we have here in Ohio. Ohio is based on a quota system, and it's set up so that the number of licenses for all kinds of alcoholic beverage sales are set by the population. Number one, the Ohio population is shrinking, so the availability of these licenses have been limited. Sometimes there's an availability of a license off in the middle of nowhere, and you can bring it to your location with what they call a tracks movement, but it's expensive, it takes time. So because of this limitation, and because our wineries, the A1s, the A2s, the A2Fs, and breweries are A1, are not limited, they become very appealing to people who want to open a bar. So people will get an A2 or an A1, and then what's called a full liquor permit. It's an A1A. There are certain restrictions with an A1A. You have to have food all the time. You have to have 2 bathrooms, lots of different requirements, and it's expensive, about $3,900 a year since it's being recorded. But it did offer the opportunity for folks who wanted to create this barn wedding environment to open a semi-fake winery to provide them the opportunity to serve full liquor at those weddings. Then along came about 3 years ago the Farm Bureau, who was looking to protect their farmers who were doing agritourism. This started out very much like corn mazes, or when people, had a farm vacation where people could experience farm life by living in a farmhouse. Agritourism was defined as an agriculturally related educational, entertainment, historic, cultural, or recreational activity. Pick your own. People come bringing the general public in to enjoy the farm experience. And a farm was also defined by this legislation. Their parcels not totaling less than 10 acres. So the farm has to be at least 10 acres, and they have agricultural production and allow a gross income of at least $2,500. What's happened is the barn wedding fad has become extremely popular. So people are picking up 10 or 15 acres of land. They are planting some grapes. They are making some wine, sometimes not so good, sometimes pretty good. Getting an A1A and building this experience in the middle of nowhere with no parking on country roads, with neighbors who don't understand what they're doing. And so the agritourism bill protected these folks who were looking to do these farm mazes, especially. The problem is the legislation made farmers almost totally non-liable for any incidents that occurred on the farm. So there have been lots of issues with these barn weddings and limitations and concerns, because the neighbors have been very upset with what's happening. So the barn weddings melded in House Bill 302, which is the ag exemption, and this agritourism that the Farm Bureau passed about 3 years ago. So we have these irritated neighbors. There were poor judgments by some of the owners. So it is important that if a barn wedding venue is going to be created, and if that's what you're looking to do, that you be authentic. It needs to include viticulture. Recently in Southwest Ohio, there was a barn wedding venue that opened up, and their agricultural product was a hay farm. They were making their money on hay. And so the local zoning appealed, went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court determined that if you are going to open a barn wedding venue and use the opportunity of agricultural exemption, the wine or spirits production, and an A1A, you had to actually grow grapes. You had to be authentically making wine, not just another agricultural commodity. However, beyond the local zoning issues and beyond the building codes, the Division of Liquor Control gets involved in the structure of your building, making sure it is appropriate for producing wine. TTB also inspects what's going on. Your local health department will be involved when it comes to water quality and sanitation sewers and septic tanks. The local food inspector is going to come in, and there are some exemptions for food. We'll talk about food exemptions down the road, but generally the health departments are involved with that. Recently up in Northeast Ohio, there's been a whole lot of brouhaha about fire departments and fire safety and fire extinguishers and extension cords and all kinds of things when it comes to sprinkler systems, very expensive. And the Department of Agriculture comes in and inspects for sanitation. And then finally, your biggest hurdle, especially you're going to be on well and on septic, your water, your wastewater, and the EPA will be folks that will come in and restrict what you're able to do and direct what you must do. So health and safety issues are never exempt from all of the opportunities that we have when it comes to House 302 and the construction of our buildings. So regardless of the circumstances, whether you're on city sewer or you're in city water or you're in the middle of the country, whether you're on a isolated little road, whether you're in a suburban environment, I cannot share with you how important it is to get to know your neighbors before you move things forward, to get to know the regulators who are in charge of directing where your life is going to be. Because if you irritate them, they can make your life miserable. They can go to stop order. There are all kinds of things that have happened in the past. So make sure you, at the beginning, go to your local authorities and say, what should I do and how can I do? If you see some kinds of burdens, some kinds of obstacles that they're putting up, call the association. We'll try and help you talk them through. And very often, a call from the neutral third party, like our offices, can help. In addition, we've worked with a lot of local prosecutors to help them understand how things can work effectively and why you should be exempt, and illustrate to them that you will be more than willing to comply where compliance is required. Thank you very much.